Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I heard the previous member talk about the need for honesty in this debate, and yet we have a Premier who's gone out there publicly talking about harsher penalties that aren't actually harsher penalties when you get into the black and white of the law. The Premier has misled Queenslanders already, and this is after 8 years in the job, dropping the ball. And ignoring the genuine fear of Queenslanders. And once again, I hear Labor members belittling the fear of Queenslanders. They have no idea. That's why it's got to this point. And the fact that it's so serious now is that there's been 8 years of a systematic failure by this government to address the issues. And so what you're facing now are hardened young criminals who have gone through the system and have not had the intervention, the appropriate intervention points in justice, because this Labor government under Premier Palaszczuk watered it down about 7 years ago. What you're seeing is consequences of not inaction but deliberate action to remove the breach of bail provisions, to make detention as a last resort, and to tie the hands of the judiciary where detention may have been a more appropriate solution, and a failure to appropriately ensure that the early intervention programs were achieving what they needed to achieve. I support early intervention, but what we haven't seen coupled with that has been transparency and action, because when there has been a progression from lower levels of crime to very serious levels of crime, and then people have got away with it time and time again, you then get the hardened criminals, and at that point it's very difficult to intervene. What we've seen is the fruit of the deliberate action of this government to water down the laws, and now they've made it so much harder. So we hear the Labor member for Redlands go on about, what is it about fear in the community, and trying to downgrade the genuine fear that people have faced, saying it's playing politics. Well, let me read from a constituent who is not a politician. They are someone who is a victim of crime. Let's not forget, these are everyday Queenslanders. They said they visited, quote, my mother in Maryborough 2 weeks ago in town, stayed the night, and we were robbed by a juvenile offender early Saturday morning, 4:30 a.m. He took the brand new iPhone 13 and keys to our Prado and tried to steal my Hyundai car. Now, he goes on to give a shout-out to the Maryborough Police and the job that they did. But how upset and intimidated his mother is, his elderly mother is, and whether she's elderly or not, that's completely destroyed her right to safety in her own home. Destroyed her right to safety. Living in fear? Yes. There are Queenslanders living in fear, and still we hear the bleating from Labor members who think it's all made up. Well, it isn't. These are people's stories. I also will note that in Nambour, in the seat of Nicklin, when you walk down the street and talk to people, and actually Nambour's next to my old hometown, which is Yandina. I went to high school in Nambour. I grew up around this area. And what we see is people who are talking. In the last few days, I've talked to them as well as previously, who said, I work in Nambour. I feel too scared to go to my car on my own after work at 5 o'clock in the afternoon because they've seen a deterioration in safety. But people's fear and actual incidents matter. But once again, we've heard Labor members downplay this, as if it doesn't matter that people are living in fear. It does.
Order. Order. Member for Logan.
It does matter. And I've been listening to members opposite.
Order. Member for Logan.
Point of order, Mr. Acting Speaker.
Pause the clock, member. What is your point of order?
I draw your attention to the fact that the member for Logan has
yes.
used unparliamentary language. I ask that he withdraw.
I'm not sure, but I'm happy to apologise for the good order of the House.
Thank you, member for Logan. Member for Maroochydore, you have the call.
Thank you. There are people everywhere throughout Queensland living in fear from crime, and this is not some made-up media story, but it's because they've experienced it. And this lady was telling me, as a worker in Nambour, that she fears walking to her car on her own after work at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, unless someone can walk with her. And that is a genuine issue. And I asked the government to explain what are the actual police strength numbers in Nambour. We know that about 8 years ago the actual police strength numbers were 30, and I'd like to ask them what are the actual police strength today. They must answer that question, as they must answer that question in other police stations throughout the Sunshine Coast and throughout Queensland, because what we have found is that they've tended to fudge the actual police numbers that are available to meet crime. At the same time, they have downgraded, they've watered down the laws in regard to juvenile justice. So you've got to have the suite of measures that this government took away and that we're fighting to see restored. So we've just seen the Olympic backflip from Premier Palaszczuk in regard to breach of bail. And didn't that set the cats among the pigeons when it went to what was happening internally in Labor, and they did their little backroom deal, oh well, we'll water down drug laws in order to give you breach of bail, and so that the left and the right can feel like they've had some win. But you cannot deny, whatever the machinations are behind closed doors, the public machinations with members who were, from the Labor side, completely opposed to bringing back breach of bail. And it's a conga line of embarrassment from the Labor side. But they're not genuine unless they actually go about putting other measures in place, such as my colleague, my colleague Dale Last, the member for Burdekin, has outlined, as my colleagues have outlined in respect to other measures to help with this particular issue. So when Queenslanders were finding at the start of this year some horrendous examples of youth crime where people had had home invasions and loss of life, such as we saw in North Lakes, such as we saw later in some of the suburbs of Brisbane. The Premier, though, where was the Premier? Certainly earlier in the year, she wasn't going to break her holiday overseas. Premier Palaszczuk just didn't turn up to work in January. Just didn't turn up to work. Took the time off for weeks when Queenslanders needed her. So much for keeping Queenslanders safe. That was just the political spin that she wanted to have when it was convenient to her in an election. But when the rubber hits the road with this issue of juvenile crime and her deliberate interventions to water down the laws and seeing the fruit of the deliberate watering down the laws, where was the Premier? She was on holidays. Extraordinary. She appears to be a part-time Premier. When there is a red carpet involved. And I believe it is unfortunate that we see a situation where when people's lives are at risk, the Premier was nowhere to be seen. And so, ultimately, what we have seen with the worsening of the impact of youth crime over a number of years, with the crisis that's been reached at a higher level than we've seen even in the past, with many communities that have been struggling with this in the last few years, the Premier was missing in action and has been disingenuous in respect to the laws that we now see before the House, particularly in regard to the so-called penalties that the Premier says she's bringing about. We've heard very clear legal treaties from my colleagues who, on the basis of other legal analysis, found that it's actually a mistruth, the level of increase in regard to the penalties that are being faced with what the Premier's talked to. The Premier promised that violent criminals should receive harsher penalties, but that's not what she's delivered in respect to 14 years in jail, potentially as a max, based on the laws that currently have been before the House when they're looked at in context with the accompanying legislation and provisions. Let's have truth about the issues that have occurred with a watering down of juvenile justice laws in Queensland. Let's give Queenslanders what they deserve, which is the right to be safe and to feel safe. and not to be ridiculed by people opposite when they don't think those things matter until their own political hide may not be safe. That's the only time they care about safety, is when there's a bit of heat under their proverbials, and therefore we start to see they have a backflip in respect to one law, but there needs to be far more
Mr. Speaker.
to be broken.